Is Anthony Stewart, and I have the great privilege and honor of being the Alumni Engagement Manager for Broward College. I hope all of you are proud of the fact that our institution was born in 1960, and since that time, think about this, 1 million people have come through its doors, taking courses, many graduated, so the impact of that over decades is just incredible and so important for our community. And I do want to give a shout out and a thank you to the alumni who are here tonight for staying engaged, for staying connected to this college. I also want to thank our host, Dr. Billy Jones, and his fellow podcaster and author, Nadine Tapsch. They are giving us an opportunity to provide this experience to you, to our alumni. And if you're not an alum, you're a friend. So everyone is included here. But this is one of the many experiences we try to put together each year. And this has become a tradition, a Halloween tradition that so many of us look forward to. Feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. You'll always be kept up to date about things that are happening with alumni and all of the experiences that we put together. I'm now going to turn the virtual mic over to Dr. Billy Jones because we have a big program tonight and lots to talk about. Welcome, everyone.
Thank you so much, Anthony, and welcome colleagues, students, alumni, community members, both locally, domestically, and internationally. My name is Dr. Billy Jones, and I have the pleasure of being a faculty at the most amazing institution in America, Broward College. And tonight is a special annual treat. Our collaboration each year gets better and better. We welcome you to this incredible webinar. And this webinar is like no ordinary webinar. Tonight, we create a tribute to classic horror icons. And some of you, I see many familiar names in the chat. You know me and you know me well. You know that I have a love and love to dabble into the horror world. But even more importantly, having great conversations about fear and things related to it. We'll talk more about that in retrospect to the themes and the visuals that you will see. But I must first acknowledge an important additional co-host of this endeavor. I call him my brother from another mother. I've known this incredible man for years. We are creative friends, brothers, and also educators. And it is with my esteemed pleasure to welcome my co-host of Fright Talk podcast, adjunct professor of Broward College, Nadine Tapsch. Welcome, Nadine.
Thank you so much, Billy. I'm looking forward to a great evening, a fantastic conversation. We could really get our spooky on. And the day right before Halloween, what better time of the year? I want to thank everybody for joining us, and thank you, Anthony and Dr. Jones, for your hard work in putting this together. I really appreciate it. Shout out to Adele Royce, because I saw that she joined the chat as well and said she was going to join. More than anything, I want us to be able to evolve this conversation, connect it to modern day, to history, and just kind of envelop in the season. Far too often, the season passes too fast. Go to the stores already. Halloween hasn't passed and they got Christmas stuff up. So let's take a moment and let's enjoy these classic horror icons. And feel free to interact with us in the chat. Dr. Jones will be moderating that, but you can more than welcome to put questions on there as we go through the different slides. So looking forward to a great evening.
And folks, in fact, this is a warning for you. Warning, as great and amazing as this conversation is, it's strongly, parental discretion is advised for those who are viewers or participants under the age of 16. And since it is Halloween Eve, if you want to get a little spook on, go ahead and turn off the lights wherever you are. Turn off the lights and just tune in if you dare. But before we proceed, as T mentioned, we want to provide a few tips for high quality engagement. Number one, as you probably have found, we've seen many of you have found the chat feature here. So continue to keep that chat love going. Type, and put in emojis, but make sure it's all good and all positive. In addition, we want you to make sure you share your ideas. So if you see something on screen that triggers you or some of your recall of something that resonates with you, go ahead and type it in the chat as well. And of course, if you're on social media like I am and as T is, we encourage you to share the love and continue to support and share the incredible work that we're doing here in this conversation on behalf of Broward College. So please, when you post, if you could kindly use the hashtag Broward College and hashtag BC alumni and friends, that it's helpful for us in order to be found in all the algorithms that take place in all the media feeds. So with that, we'll start with this. Could you all go to the chat and do the following, please? What is a classic horror icon to you? Can you go to the chat and share that, please? What do you think is a classic horror icon? And T, for you and me, we have our own definition, but we're going to see what the audience provides here. We're seeing some interesting points. Some of them are, some features coming up. Dracula, Frankenstein, specific examples of definitions, whatever you feel. There's no rules here. You're not getting graded. The Shining, Chucky. I feel like it's Scream and Chucky. Norman Bates, Creature from the Black Lagoon. Oh my gosh, look at all these great examples. Mike Myers, Freddy Krueger, werewolves,
Jack the Ripper.
Jack the Ripper.
That's a good one.
Oh my gosh, something that makes me think creepy. Vampires. So you have all of these classic horror icons. Hannibal Lecter, clowns, Carrie, Invisible Man. I'm glad you're mentioning all these. You gave me great examples. And someone, yes, thank you much. Someone included and made a comment or an attempt rather at defining what a classic horror icon is. So for you, T, what is a classic horror icon?
For me, a classic horror icon is any character or story where your brain instantly recognizes what it is as creepy. So if I say Frankenstein, I have an image in my head immediately of what Frankenstein looks like. I remember the storyline. That to me makes it iconic. Not just for me, but if you're having a conversation with somebody and you say Frankenstein, for the most part, you're not going to have to explain who Frankenstein is or what Frankenstein looks like because people will automatically have that image in their head. So for me, a classic horror icon is a character that is easily identifiable in your mind, but also has that creepy element, right? Because Clifford the Big Red Dog is very identifiable, but he ain't creepy, right? So when we're talking about our horror icons, we want to make sure that we're talking about stories, movies. I mean, it's not limited, shows, whatever that means to people. For me, it means that it's a horror character that's easily identifiable with fear and easily visualized in your mind. And what about you, Dr. Jones? Because I know you know so many of the classic horror icons because you and I have had vast conversations about it. What comes to mind when you think of a horror icon?
I think of kind of like what Professor Segala said earlier about the archetypes. These individuals are icons. These entities are characters that resonate through classic or canonical literature, but also because as technology evolves and emerging technologies are introduced, so does horror. And so as a result, we have film historically. We now have AI. We have all these other options and examples that help us grow and identify. The key is this: people are more likely to remember the characters before they remember the name of a film or a book. And that's a good thing. And that's with intention, folks, which is where our conversation is going tonight. Loving the comments in there. Thank you, Jeannie. The CHI is a person, Chai is a person, or thing that scares me. Jack Torrance. Oh, Jack Torrance from The Shining. I mean, you're naming so many classics. It's not always the monster under the bed, would you say? It's not always the monster under the bed, but as children, we all fancied all kinds of things. And we all had things that may have excited us or scared us. Some of us were afraid of the dark or the very toys that we breathe life into as we played with them during the day. They sat very lifeless at night. Or even more so, the idea that perhaps the shadows that are looming in the closets or in the outer reaches of the room in which one sleeps, they were just shadows, right? Or perhaps they were something more. We don't know, and we're not here to prove what may or may not exist. We're here to celebrate the classic horror icons. So tonight, you're going to see a tribute to a variety of these classic icons, from books to films, regardless of their medium source. The fact is that they exist, and they exist because we, as humanity, created them, and embraced them. They have become part of our own cultural identities. So let's explore some of the classic horror icons of culture, books, and film. So someone said earlier Dracula, and the vampire lore is one of the most popular, in fact, one of the most popular characters that transcends and crosswalks many cultures is the vampire or Dracula. And for me, it's one of my personal favorite. I can't really think of a vampire movie that I haven't watched and then appreciate it. But for some, the idea, especially in terms of the history of which this, he has been created or at least drawn from, we know that history. We know Vladimir the Impaler. We know that history, and we understand how that may have influenced. But that's just from one cultural societal view. Many other cultures have actually created or had relics or identities or icons that associate with Dracula. For me, Dracula really epitomizes and almost sits like supreme or king or queen, depending on your perspective of horror. Because you can't have a holiday, at least Halloween in America, without the identity or even the silhouette of Dracula, even in cartoons, right, T?
True. It's very true. And interesting enough, people they connect Dracula with Nosferatu. Dracula, that character of Dracula was created before Nosferatu was. And Dracula, as you mentioned, is very iconic. But it's also there's the history component. So you mentioned Vlad the Impaler. We also know that archaeologists had found bodies buried in a way that people were believed to be vampires or believed in vampirism, and we're talking about old world Europe. And so we know that we have the story of Dracula, or the one that Bram Stoker puts forward, that a lot of people think of. But well before that, throughout history, people believed in vampirism, and in I believe that the first mention of it was in Russia in around 1047. And so the character we have today of Dracula, it transcends because it's a little bit of everything. And when you think of other monsters, think of current vampires. They're not ugly. I mean, sometimes they'll make them to be hideous, but for the most part, you have these immortal beings that are very classy, and they can, according to the horror icons, they can transform into a bat and so on and so forth. But it's such a great pull from history to develop the Dracula and the vampires that we have today. Bela Lugosi obviously did a great job when he did the original ones in I believe it was the 30s, I believe, when he did those original ones. And it's just something that sticks in your mind. I mean, even when you think, and somebody mentioned on here about the universal monsters, Dracula is one of those universal monsters that we think of. It's one of those great icons that we think of. And what's fantastic about this is that you can have a vampire movie, a vampire book, and no longer have Dracula in it. And for the longest time, Dracula was the main character of any story that moves forward with vampires. But it's developed in such a way, it's created its own animal in which all vampire movies and films now are in some way derived from the character of Dracula.
One of my first and favorite scary stories that I've ever read was actually Bram Stoker's Dracula. And because Stoker's work is beyond the Creative Commons license for intellectual property, one can find it very easily and immediately on social media or on the internet for free. And so it's one of those classic works. I love the reading of it. But when I saw the film and I watched the classic, to your point, that celebrates this icon, it is the use of sounds and music. Horror is not horror without sounds, folks, and music plays a very integral role in that. And so I remember one part in the film, the black and white film, you hear this howling. It says, the creatures of the night, the children of the night, and the fact that he called that the sounds or whatever were making them children, Dracula made them familiar. And so it's one of the first that starts us off here. And what music they make is such awesome. I love the fact someone mentioned SpongeBob too.
Yes.
Well, Dracula's a good start, but then there's Dracula, and then there's this guy. There's Frankenstein. And folks, as you see your favorite, drop a Halloween or scary emoji in the chat if you see one of your favorite icons mentioned here. And of course, drop your questions too in your comments, because we're going to be jumping in and out of the chat to include or encourage your conversation. But Frankenstein, I was sharing it just a few hours earlier. The doctor was Frankenstein. Yeah, the doctor was Frankenstein. Thank you for saying that. People don't realize that, but I have to add another piece of history here. So Percy Shelley, who was the significant other of Mary Shelley, they were out on vacation or on holiday, and there was a third author or writer whose name escapes me. Kevin, if you're there, help me recall my history here. But what happened was they were on this tour. Byron, thank you, Kevin. And as they were out there on holiday, they actually had a challenge for creating, let's create some scary works. And Mary Shelley set to working. It was almost like a bet. And she set to working Frankenstein, and here we are. And so it's an interesting story, to have an identity or an entity created by man of all other human remains of human and brought to life. It was supposed to be a representation of a number of things. And as Elizabeth is mentioning here, representation, a metaphor of the Industrial Revolution, absolutely. Art imitating life, absolutely. Also identifies the stories and themes of rejection and acceptance as well. It reinforces the notion of power, especially for Dr. Frankenstein and how he behaved. It also had a somber tone or reality as the creature itself became the icon, but yet Dr. Frankenstein is the creator. Interesting story.
And this is one of those characters that when I was talking about earlier, when you mention a name, immediately you can imagine what that character looks like. And I know Frankenstein was the doctor, but if you were to say Frankenstein, this is the image or something similar to this is what comes to pass and what comes to mind, right? Because it was such a great job in building what this monster was supposed to look like, or this corpse, to make it look hideous. The other aspect that we get from the Frankenstein story is the townspeople and the villagers with the torches and the pitchforks. That's part of, I believe that's such a part of horror icon as well, because you'll see that in some vampire movies as well. And so that portion of it, of this misunderstood creature, and here are the townspeople with torches and pitchforks because they fear what they do not understand. And then you have this character, this monster, if you will, that's let loose in the village, not let loose on purpose, but which reminds me, big shout out to Young Frankenstein, by the way, if you guys have never seen that movie, phenomenal take on the Frankenstein story. But Billy, if somebody were to say to you, Frankenstein, and you had your eyes closed, what would you picture? What are some of the physical characteristics you would think of?
Well, it doesn't help that I watched The Monsters or I've seen the Addams Family that has a rendition of him.
Right.
It's interesting because this character himself, it's interesting. He exists, but then she does too.
Yes.
The Bride of Frankenstein. And the fact that there was an identity to bring them together was a fascinating moment in film history and filmology. I thought it was fascinating. It was a characterization because we don't get that in the initial work itself. We get this in the follow-ups. And so to give Frankenstein a significant other, and then that significant other, we thought they would just go on their honeymoon and live happily ever after. But you know what? That's also in life. Not every story ends that way, right? And so it's interesting because now as we look at these horror characters, we begin to recognize, well, there's certain identities or genders that are associated with horror more so. And in no way here as an audience, we want to embrace it all. But I think it's quite fascinating that in the early times, especially as Mary Shelley, a woman made Frankenstein, right? The story of Frankenstein, the novel. But then as we move forward, we get all these other kind of entities and beings that come up. And so interesting. But let's move a little further, shall we? Take a look at this. The Legend of Sleepy Hollow is one of my favorite stories, and I used to assign it many years ago when I was teaching composition courses. And the story itself, I got turned on by it, actually not by its reading as a child, but actually as the cartoon, during Halloween that would come on. I believe it was Disney that released it. And it
Yeah.
was very creepy and it did a very good job of creeping out, us. But I don't know if any of you here in the audience, have you been to Sleepy Hollow? Have you actually visited Sleepy Hollow? Have any of you actually visited Sleepy Hollow? It is such an incredible place. I've not been visited. I only visited virtually. I plan to do so. It's on my bucket list. But definitely this story of Sleepy Hollow and the turn of events that take place in Ichabod Crane, what a great story. It is a great classic story that looks great in animation and as well in literature.
Absolutely. And let me nerd out for a minute for my history folks out there. The story, and there's a few stories tonight that are based off of a portion of history. And this one in particular, The Headless Horseman, we know that it was written by Washington Irving, and he actually derived this story from a battle that took place during the Revolutionary War in White Plains. And then he changed the story to Winchester, New York for Sleepy Hollow. And it was about a soldier who was decapitated by a cannonball. And when he was decapitated by a cannonball, Washington Irving heard of this story and he created the legend of Sleepy Hollow, which is phenomenal. And the book originally was, well, not the book, it was a short story, was a great way to just at the time just let's get this creepy legend out. Now, Billy, were you a fan of the film?
I was. I actually was. I actually was. I think the film was really cool. And what I like is that every time these films introduce these legends or icons to new generations, it's quite fascinating to see how new generations take them in. And so for us, for instance, I eventually read it when I was older in high school, but to see it, initially as a cartoon was quite fascinating. It was actually quite scary for a child to see this.
Right.
But now, I mean, if you think about it, the idea of anything headless, America's not the only one that has a headless entity. I learned recently that in Brazil, I was talking to my better half, who you know well, and we were talking about in Brazil, there is I forgot the name of it, but it's a headless horse. It's a horse without a head, but it has flames coming out of it. And it's part of the lore in Brazil. And so when we see these icons, it's really neat when new generations begin to mix them and incorporate them and embody them into modern times. And I'm looking at a really cool comment there. Kevin writes, there's a wonderful rendition of the story read by Glenn Close that I've been listening to since childhood. It's from the Rabbit Ears. It's from Rabbit Ears, if anyone is curious. They have a classic collection of classic stories, of which Sleepy Hollow is one. Yes, it is. The sound effects are incredible. Let me tell you, the audio books that we have today, and some of the audio features that we get, I mean, talk about taking things to another level. Close your eyes, folks, and let your imagination run wild by listening to these narrations and these sounds. Absolutely. And of course, the movie that featured Johnny Depp. I love that movie. A lot of people criticized it as you asked. A lot of folks criticized it. I personally loved it, and I remember seeing it at the movies. But this next character, it's one of the most celebrated around the world. La Bruja, the witch, the warlock. And it's interesting because witch stories to me, any witch storyline, when I read one or watch one, I don't know why I'm personally fascinated. Maybe I'm like a witch from the previous life. Maybe I was burned at the stake in Salem in the 17th century. I don't know. But the point is, Salem, which I visited too, John, it is such an awesome place. I wouldn't go now though. Halloween, it's quite busy. It's like Fantasy Fest in the Keys. But definitely the witch itself, there's so many stories from the ones that we get from our early childhood of Hansel and Gretel, from that version from the Grimm fairy tales to what we get today with the have you seen Hansel and Gretel? The movie itself and how they become like witch hunters. Okay, that's a different spin. So even in American Horror Story, we talked about this on a podcast a couple years back, T, in terms of how witches, one of my personal episodes on American Horror Story was season 3, and
Uh-huh.
season 7,
The
which
Coven.
actually had the Coven, was it 3?
Mhm.
Yeah, exactly. And 7 had the Apocalypse, I think it was,
Yeah.
where the witches were the storyline, one of my personal favorites.
Yeah. So I want to address two things that were mentioned here. So John Donovan is correct. They never burn witches at the stake in Salem. So I got to give you props for getting that right, John. And then Alexis Santana, yes, I agree that Coven was the best season of American Horror Story. Now, you know, Billy, that I have a soft spot for witches in my heart. I love witches, and I'm going to explain to you why I love witches. Witches have been around, the stories of witches have been around since Mesopotamia. That's how far back stories of witches go. And in a lot of stories, witches, classical stories and ancient literature, witches were seen as healers, as the type that people would go to for help and for assistance. And then at somewhere along the line, to make it scarier or spookier, they tried to make witches, they wrote witches,
Mm,
and they would then go into movies, but they would write witches to be hideous
mhm.
and, green skin and the long nose and the bump in the nose and all of this stuff to make it feel more creature-like. And when in actuality, the modern take on witches in a lot of the shows, if you think of, Charmed, Practical Magic, even The Craft, witches do not look that way. Witches not written that way anymore because it's such an old way of describing witches. Witches are one of my favorite characters as horror icons. Also because I know there are no real life, to my knowledge, Frankensteins or Frankenstein monsters. You see what I'm saying? So I have a love and affinity for witches if they're written correctly in the story. And I feel, and I've said this before in our podcast, for a long time, witches have gotten a bad rap. And I've seen it written where witches are beautiful and they're helping, and there's different types of witches. And then, of course, I've seen it where the witch, she cooks the children in the oven in the Hansel and Gretel story. So it's such a great horror icon. And even in the movie The Witch, which if you haven't seen The Witch, came
It's a
out
great movie. Yeah.
phenomenal movie, very creepy. But even then, they didn't make the witch to be hideous or anything like that. I love the witch characters in modern witch characters as it's written. I think that it's a phenomenal take, and I love when they include multiple horror icons in one volume of a story, or multiple horror icons in one film or television series. But yeah, I have a soft spot for witches.
I love the one of the mentions there from John. He mentioned Bewitched by Elizabeth Montgomery. I remember that. I wanted to be a kid. I wanted to be her daughter, and I wanted to wriggle my nose and make things happen. Or even the classic, the production play. I've seen the play Wicked twice. It's
Yeah,
a great play. Now it's made into a musical or production now on film. So we're also seeing it there with some major stars as well. The Witch
yeah.
is definitely one that we'll never forget.
Yeah, and the witch, Wendy Varela, yes, the witch was so creepy. But it was such a great film. It was such a great film, written such a good way.
Now look at this one, folks. Now here's one. I follow Linda Blair on social media. And the things that this woman was saying, this child was saying at the time in which this movie was made, what an incredible movie. It was one of the movies that absolutely scared me. One of my first introductions to visual horror was The Exorcist. And this is as Adele writes, this is the single scariest movie. So many folks, so many witches, and so few warlocks. Oh, that's interesting. Oh my God, this movie creeped me out, as Alexis writes. The Exorcist is a quite fascinating movie because the notion of being possessed by spirits, and that now not only being possessed, but also requiring the church, religion playing a very integral role in expelling these circumstances. Well, this is actually, known in some aspects of culture and history. But even more so, the fact that a child, I think the point of view of this story is quite fascinating because a child, the spirits manifest in children, although there are many records around the world, both not only in fictional stories, but in historical records of people of varying ages and societies being possessed. But it is this character that has become such a household face, and Linda Blair mentioned in an interview that I watched recently on YouTube. She mentioned like this character almost got her like got her cast. She was cast so well and did so well in the role that it was hard for her to deviate or go on to other things. But in the same regard, folks still identify her. Even now, as a mature adult, she still appreciates what this film has done. Even the film locations have become popular for individuals to actually stand at the steps, and so of the actual famous scene in the movie. So at the end of the day, The Exorcist to me is one of those iconic movies that now brings in the ghost, the spirit world, the notion that things can control us, and that perhaps there may be other dimensions and voids that may consume us if we're not careful, or even more so, prey on the most innocent in our world.
You know, Billy, when we talk about classic horror icons, the poster for this film with the priest standing outside those little gates in front of that townhouse looking thing, that was so creepy in such a phenomenal way. They did such a great job with that. And they, it's all purposeful, right? They used a younger girl because they figured a creature, human, so innocent, because it was such a young girl, to be possessed by this demon, um, was just a great flip of the script for the time. It was so innovative, and people were like, "Oh my God, look at this!" And it made it creepier because it was less expected, right? And so this whole story of The Exorcist, think of all the stories that have come from this one story. You have the exorcism of Emily Rose, you have the Pope's exorcist, and then you have all of these, and we know that exorcisms is something historically that have happened, right? So whenever you have a component of something that's actually happened and it gets rewritten in a way to kind of feature it in a film or feature it in a story, it kind of hits a little closer, right? Because a lot of people will say that will see this and say, "Oh, this is a priest going to exorcise a demon from this little girl." This film, for its time, drew you in and just kept you guessing the entire time of what was going to happen to this girl. I thought it was phenomenal.
T, you bring up something we talked about some time ago on a podcast. I personally, folks, and I'm laughing and chuckling at John's comment there, Professor Donovan's comment. I don't want to see children hurt or harmed in films and in horror. And even as a writer, whenever there are calls for publications, they'll put in there what they're looking for and what they're not looking for, like the rules for submissions. And one of the common lines I see in many of the publications, and some of them, even in some extreme horror, no children will be harmed in the story or in your submission of your poem if it's narrative, etc. So I, like you said earlier, the notion that a child could be incorporated or used as the image or the vessel of horror is quite original for its time. But now we have this guy. And every time I see him, actually did this earlier today in class when I was discussing fear in retrospect to the discussion reading that we had for the class. And the students and I put up William Shatner's face. He is from the classic Star Trek. And I juxtaposed it to this mask. And they're like, "Oh my God, he looks the same." He's the same. But Michael Myers is the character. Halloween is the series or the brand. And the character itself brings in the most popular, one of the most popular tropes of the horror genre, and that is the final girl. The fact is, someone just mentioned her in the line, Jamie Lee Curtis, who got her start, who, by the way, is a child of some great stars, right? Some celebrity stars, right? And so, as the reason, Tony Lee Curtis, for instance, was her dad. And her mom was the famous mom in the shower scene of Psycho, the famous shower scene. So talk about being born to be a scream queen. But Michael Myers is one of those icons that just gets me and still creeps me out. And I say this why? Because he doesn't talk. He only has a mask and a knife. He's brawny, he's tall, he towers, and he reinforces it's the final girl gets to live another scene to see another sequel and live with her trauma of being the final girl in a movie like this. But the icon becomes popular and commercialized for the Halloween costumes. It's quite fascinating.
And when it comes to the Halloween series, they have literally built a monster. It's a mechanism that runs on its own. I believe that there's about 13 Halloween movies. Every few years they come out with another one, which is genius marketing, by the way. I also enjoyed, Billy, the Rob Zombie version of Halloween, where it takes us a little bit to the earlier Michael Myers. But and I believe it was Anthony that mentioned it. Yes, it's Anthony. He mentioned about the music. Think of how iconic, not just the character, but that music. When you hear it, you're like, "Oh, something bad's about to happen." Right? So the classic Michael Myers from the beginning films, you get this character, like you said, he doesn't speak, and he is just a killing machine. He is just out there for one thing. And the fact that that whole you could be running and then all of a sudden he turns up at the next corner. You know, there's this fascination of in the Halloween series of you cannot escape him. And I think that intrigues people because we go into these films knowing that something bad is going to happen. But I guess somehow we still hope that, you know, the person survives and the monster dies or whatever the case is. But with Halloween and Michael Myers, he just keeps regenerating and coming back. It's a sensational series. Some of the films were worse than others. I think H2O was not a good Halloween film. But having said that, for the majority, they are still very enjoyable. And what I like about the Halloween series is that it has gone on for several decades, for a few decades, right? And so somebody who appreciated it in the early 80s can appreciate a newer version of it today. And that I think is sensational. And that creates a classic horror icon.
Well said. And speaking of which, let's talk about his cousin here, Jason Voorhees. Oh, Jason and Friday the 13th. I hope none of you have triskaidekaphobia, the fear of 13. It's one of my favorite numbers, by the way. But Dan Marino for the Dolphins would tell you otherwise. You see, Jason Voorhees himself in Friday the 13th, what an interesting story. A very different spin on, from the final girl trope to some extent. But I think the trauma, I think out of the two characters, I think within the context of the initial installation of the first installment of the movie, we get a backstory of a monster. And we begin to realize, oh, wait, he had child trauma. Not that it justifies, this further explains the actions or behaviors. And so as a result, we get another brawny guy, an invincible character as well. So one had a butcher knife. This one here has a machete or whatever else he can get. And I love the fact when these movies get together and they take these icons and they pair them with each other. And, like I remember when Jason versus Freddy came out, and I thought that was hilarious. Anything with that character, takes in another direction, Freddy wise. But Jason himself and the hockey masks, the notion of the mask, concealing, hiding the ugly, hiding the familiar, but yet being obscure and sinister. It's quite interesting.
Yeah, so so at the time that Jason comes out, there is, especially in the late 70s, throughout the 80s, summer camps were very popular, right?
Yeah.
And so you have other horror films like Sleepaway Camp in the 80s, so on and so forth. So they grabbed this idea of these camps that you're going to spend overnight, and you have the camp counselors, and here you have somebody just terrorizing a camp that's pretty remote. It's going to be hard for you to find help or anything like that. And they grab this horror character and they put him in these scenes, and you hear the music again, right? That specific music to Jason, where he's still able to catch up to you, where he can walk through the water and you're like, oh, wait a second, he's not breathing because he just walked out of the water. And it's scary because you're like, okay, where's he gonna appear next? And sometimes the music will clue you in as to, is something gonna pop up now? Is it not? But the Jason films, I believe, are very good. There's a few of them that I can say, like, there's one of Jason, like X, Jason in space. Jason does not belong in space. Keep him in the camp. He's fine in the camp. He doesn't need to travel anywhere else. However, you mentioned Freddy versus Jason. In the 80s, Friday the 13th and Nightmare on Elm Street were going through this box office battle of these characters. And they were always trying to outdo each other in how they created these films. And a lot of people, a lot of teenagers specifically at the time, were like, well, I'm Team Jason or I'm Team Freddy. And finally, they came out with Freddy versus Jason. He's a phenomenal horror icon, and people to this day still appreciate the story of Jason. Now, you could draw similarities to Jason and Michael Myers, but within their own right, they are horror icons in their own settings.
Yep. And then there's the lycanthrope, the wolf, the lichen. I have to tell you, I personally, for me, I would there are other icons we've already presented that I am more intrigued by.
Mhm.
But when I read a wolf story and to read it, to literally read it, to read a transformation, it is astounding. I feel like I get more out of that than the visuals. The visuals are good. I'm not discrediting it in any way, but I have to admit the werewolf lore is one that is iconic, that many cultures transcends many societies. The idea that that human can transform, or that at certain seasons or certain environmental conditions can actually become something other, a familiar of other sorts. Not just wolves, there are other trends, there are other things as well. But these movies, the werewolf lore, I think werewolf began to really get its catch in the modern sense. We don't get a lot of literature that's werewolf based, but we do get a lot. It's unless it's in children's stories. Let's start there. We do
Right.
quite a bit, and classic children's fairy tales, and also the symbolism behind that is quite fascinating. What's your take on the wolf? I feel, to me, I love a wolf story, especially there's a new movie that's coming out that's really going to feature a wolf, where this father, it's called Werewolf, I think it's called. I think I sent it to you a couple weeks in email. And he's going out, and he and his daughter, his teenage daughter and a younger daughter, they're going out into the woods, and then they get attacked by something, but he gets bitten. It's like a wolf. And all of a sudden now the daughters have to kind of fend for themselves because daddy is transforming. It's a very classic and very modern day classic that I think will make itself well, because now it pits, it's not about the monster, it's about what are these kids going to do to survive their very dad, who is now going to become the other. So it's quite interesting. And I love what W. Gale wrote. One of the fundamental draws of horror is the idea of the disguised other. Absolutely. The othering.
See, I put the werewolf in the same category as the Frankenstein monster, Dracula, and witches. I put the werewolf in that category. And the reason I do is because it's one of the few characters. If you think about the stories you've seen or the films you or have read or the films you see, it's one of the few characters that go into vivid description of its transformation.
Oh, yeah.
You see the hands gnarl and the feet break out of the shoes and the shirts rip off. And that's one of the things that, and sometimes you'll see a horror character where it'll slowly show as they take off a mask or something to that effect. But in the werewolf, you're seeing the full transformation of it. So you're seeing it go from man or human or woman to wolf. And I find that to be very interesting and very intriguing. The whole idea and notion of the full moon, right? And that's the time to stay inside. Now, there's a phenomenal show on Peacock. There's 2 seasons out, I believe, 3, and I believe it's Wolf Like Me is what it's called. Essentially, this father is, spoiler alert, this father and his daughter meet a woman, and in this particular story, the male is not the werewolf. And so everything that encompasses, which is an interesting take on it. There have been great movies on werewolves. There have been Silver Bullet from the 80s was a good movie as well. But I put the werewolf in that, and there were also the classic black and white films of werewolves. So I guess because of those films, I put the werewolf in that category of Dracula and the Frankenstein monster.
Well, there was a film. Remember what was the name of the film, folks? Audience as well. What was the film with the wolves, and it had Celine, and she, Underworld. Thank you, Kevin. I love that movie. I love that franchise. I think it's a great
I've heard
franchise
it.
to show the battle between werewolves and vampires. It's quite fascinating. Twilight as well reinforces it. I'll be honest. I thought Twilight, yes, I get it. People will think it's a little more campy, but I will admit it worked for its time. It was quite celebrated. And then we get to other things, the toys that we love. And this icon, dolls. Some folks are creeped out by dolls, the notion of dolls and dolls being now possessed or exercised on. Chucky was quite a character, one that the film world at least had never seen before. One so popular that now modern streaming has now created series off of him. And he's funny, he's witty, he has a TV show. He actually has a doll. The doll is $500, folks, by the way. So these iconic characters are now not only costumes, but they're also toys that people actually buy. The actual Chucky, the bride, and yes, the son as well can be purchased.
Billy, Okay, so this is gonna because this is gonna come up with another character too. I have a hard time finding the Chucky series scary.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
And I think it's because when you get used to watching films like Halloween and Friday the 13th and some other ones, the classic, the animated doll does not, at the time it was like it was a very good concept, right? Because we hadn't seen anything like it. But now as time has passed, you say to yourself, well, in comparison to some of the other classic horror icons, is he as scary? Probably not, at least in my book. But he is definitely a horror icon because the creation of Chucky was so innovative at the time. And I believe it was Elizabeth that pointed out, yes, that Elizabeth pointed out that it was based on the Buddy doll. So it kind of made it real, this idea that you give a gift to your child, and this gift turns out to be a killing machine is obviously scary in itself. But when we compare this horror icon to the other ones, do you feel that he falls a little short in the scary end?
No, he's funny. He's dark horror, as John said. He's dark humor, and I mean, so is Freddy Krueger. I didn't think Freddy was scary. I thought
Right.
he was like pedophilic, honestly, in certain aspects.
Oh, right.
But he was also quite comical. Or Leprechaun, who's another example. These are dark, dark humor or dark horror or comedy horror. In fact, then we get to the Scream franchise, which actually changed the game 30 plus years ago. We're going to spitfire. We're going to hit some spitfire here because we have 12 minutes left, folks. So we're going to try to show you some of the more classic icons. The Ghostface Killer, the Scream, from the actual original, what's featuring Nev Campbell, to the others that the Wayans brothers have recreated. I thought that the Ghostface Killer was one of the most classic, not great storyline. Even the Fox series, the Scream Queens that actually took
Right.
this on as well. I thought it was really clever to give that version. It's not one of my personal favorite, but it's a good experience.
When the film first came out, the first Scream film, I did not think it was going to be a cult classic, and it turned out to be because they came out with the other ones. I think at the same time came I Know What You Did Last Summer. Scream was better received than that film was, and so as it went on and created more films, and when they created more films, they then created the TV show. Definitely, Ghostface and Scream have to be put in the classic horror icon.
Ah, and then there's Carrie. And then there's Carrie, the rejected, misunderstood, not only at home, but also in school. The iconic Carrie and Stephen King. Wow. I love this story. I love the storyline of Carrie. And I even like, I like reading it. I think the reading is great, but I really like the original. It started, was it Sissy Spacek who
Yeah.
started the original? I thought the original was classic. The follow-ups are very nice, but I really like this story. And it just, it just reminds us again and again, if we're not careful, we never know how we may treat or exclude others. Because if they eventually get the upper hand, what will they do? And if you're pushed to that precipice of no point of no return, what will you do? Or what could you tap? It's just a thought.
I'm going to tell you this, and I'm going to say this to our audience, and I want you guys to hit up the chat if you agree with me. You don't have to agree with me. I was rooting for Carrie the entire time in this film and in the novel. She was tortured in school, she was tortured at home, and to me, she is not the villain. So that's what I love about this story. She is not the villain in this story. She is the one pushing back against the real villains. I love the story of Carrie. I think that the remake was good. And somebody mentioned Moonlight mentioned I felt so bad for her. Yes, that was it. You felt so bad for her. So when all this blood is coming down and all these things are happening, I I sympathize almost with her
Yeah.
character. I really do. So I love the story of Carrie. I believe that after the first film and after the novel and the film, she instantly became a classic horror icon. I did not think the remake was horrible, but I really sympathize with the character. I was rooting for her lockstep.
Mm. And then there are those, if you know Florida history, right? And the mystery of and then Jupiter, the murder clown, right? But clowns themselves being the icon figure of horror. Pennywise, what Stephen King did with Pennywise, and then the later versions have been quite fascinating. The original still scares me. But I will tell you this, clowns also scare me. I never got Ronald McDonald. I never understood him. I get their happy things. I was always afraid of them as a child. But the fact is now Pennywise has become such an iconic identity that almost as if makes even the original Pennywise was really neat. I really like the original Pennywise, but I equally like this Pennywise too.
Yeah, Pennywise is the story of it and Pennywise is such a great character. People are not everybody obviously, but there's people that have a major phobia and fear of clowns. Remember, we talked about this in the podcast, Billy, a few years ago. People thought it would be cute to dress as clowns and go out in the middle of the night on people's property. What a stupid
And
idea.
ring their doorbells.
And ring their doorbell. What a horrible idea.
Terrifier. Thank you, John.
Yes, yes.
Terrifier. Oh my gosh.
Terrifier, by the way,
Right now,
shout
yeah.
out, because Terrifier will be a classic horror icon if he's not.
Oh yes.
I love the story of Pennywise and it. I liked the original film better than the remakes, but it still holds true.
And then we have Leatherface, who, by the way, Edward Gain was a real man, everyone. We've covered that conversation in the past where, if you read the story, we're not going to give the recap due to time because we just have 8 minutes. But the fact is that his identity, as well as the identity of Psycho, could really create these iconic characters based on the true happenings and circumstances of Edward Gain. What an incredible storyline.
Yeah, and that iconic dancing with the chainsaw in the middle of the street, like that is just such a classic as they're getting away. That is phenomenal.
And what do you think? Here's Johnny.
Here's Johnny. Talk about writer's block, right?
Oh, Jack Torrance. What an incredible villain Adele writes. The most horrible. Oh yeah, the most horrible. We only have a few minutes, right? Yeah, it's all fun. I will tell you this. This is one of my personal favorite novels. Remember Stephen King, he received what, over 20 rejections before he was, accepted to publish because people just didn't get it, right? But now, if you look at what he's done, he's become not only a book name or a brand, his novels are really cool. It's also a household name. This is one of the most classic characters, along with Carrie and Christine, a car.
Yes. And the hotel
The
scene,
hotel,
breaking of the
the
door,
hotel itself, which
the
is actual
hotel
true
itself,
place, how he was inspired. The story itself is quite fascinating.
red rum, and I mean, yeah.
What do you think of that one, T?
Pinhead, I know he's your favorite. I know he is. Again, original concepts. This is a concept that came out in the 80s. Very original. People were drawn to this. Why? Because it was different from the Michael Myers and the Freddy and the Jason. This was a different spin on it. So people were attracted to Pinhead and to the Hellraiser series because of that. People wanted their horror, but they wanted it different than what they were used to already.
I'll share this. Clive Barker, one of my personal favorite writers. The whole the Love Bound Heart series, which is where a lot of this comes from. What a fascinating line. I thought the readings of it, I love the classic works, but the modern rendition of it, where Pinhead was actually a female in the new remake, it was quite interesting. Candyman, Candyman. Don't say it. Don't say Bloody Mary 3 times in the mirror in the dark. I mean, the idea, Candyman himself, this is an interesting. I thought that the social justice spin on the modern version of this incredible film was quite interesting. I didn't see that in this original, but yet it had its own creep factor. And I don't know. This one is one of those films that just I don't know what to think.
I didn't not like it at the time.
Right.
It's not that I don't like the film. I thought the film was good. I thought the sequel was fine. I like the originality of this is going to take place in an urban setting, where a lot of the times when you think of Michael Myers in the Halloween series, that's in the suburbs. You think of Jason Voorhees, that's in a sleepaway camp. I like that Candyman's taking place in an urban area that's more populated because that's not something you see very often when it comes to those classic horror icons because they try to to separate or have people more solitary. So that's the part that I really enjoyed about the spin of the Candyman.
Don't fall asleep. 1, 2, Freddy's coming for you. 3, 4, better lock your door. I'm not gonna keep singing it because
Billy, remember what his job was, right?
wasn't he a janitor or
He was a janitor. That's
he was a
right.
janitor at a school? Like the
That's right.
storyline was crazy. I will
Yeah.
be honest, I love watching what he would say. He was a mess. He was hilarious.
He was funny.
He was hilariously
He was
funny.
funny.
Oh my
He was
God.
funny. And
Yeah, parents killed him. That's right, John. I mean, the
right.
storyline, the
Yes.
whole historical backdrop, it's like,
From
oh,
the boiler room, right? He started.
yeah.
Yeah. Yes. Okay. No. Just no, Billy. I don't find this scary to me. This is not scary. This is.
Well, I'll
I
send you one. I'll send you one for Christmas.
That's fine.
I'll send you one. I'm gonna see Dr. Parker one. I'm gonna see VP. I'm gonna see Vice Provost Suarez one. Where I see Director Varela and Anthony. They're all getting an Annabelle for Christmas. But the idea itself of the Annabelle is quite fascinating. You know, plant one in school, or I should bring one to class one day. Um, they're here.
Children of the Corn. Yes. Tomorrow Bell. Yes. Children of the Corn.
This movie, though, I mean, this movie in itself, even but from its directorship, it should be studied. Even in any of the Easter eggs that are propped or placed within the film are quite fascinating, that reinforce the context of the time in which the story was made, and also to the uncanny circumstances, such as Heather O'Rourke and her untimely passing at 14. And like there are all these stories behind the creating of this. And Steven Spielberg did an incredible work. But the idea that a house can be contended or possessed, the place that you lay your head and you want to raise your family and feel of safe and solitude to be challenged, that's scary.
Yeah, and for this, I'm just going to answer Steve. Steve, you need to get that looked at. He put sometimes my TV turns on by itself. Get that situation under control, Steve.
Yeah. But then there's another situation there, Steve. Do you want your poltergeist, your playful ghost, which is what poltergeist is, or do you want your Amityville? I have a friend who lived down the street. He passed away recently, but he was a dear colleague of mine who lived down the street from Amityville, houses down. And his brother went to high school with the son who actually committed the challenge in that house. And I used to ask him, did you see things? He said, no, there were all these people. I didn't see anything, but we didn't go in the house, but there was all this snooping going on. But Amityville itself was such a story that is based on a very horrific true crime story.
It is. And folks, if you have the chance, look up the real story because it is based off a true story. And there have been several of the Amityville horror movies.
I think Margot Kidder starred in the original. I loved her version, her take on it.
Well, here's the thing about the alien. The alien in itself is scary. It is a classic monster, but it's when it goes more towards the realm of sci-fi, is it still horror? Is it sci-fi horror like Jason in Space, but obviously significantly better than that? I love the alien character the same way I love the Predator character and how they did that because it was very, very creepy and how up close they get to the characters, to the faces and all that. I thought I like the Alien series and the different ones. I find it as scary as some of the other ones, some of the other classic horror icons that we talked about. I did not.
Yeah, Kevin said it there. It's all genre fiction, It's
Yeah.
like Jaws in space,
Yeah.
And
Yep.
it had that similar line with a different little remix that I would think compared to Jaws. I remember the alien storyline better than Jaws for some reason. But as we arrive in our modern day time, and I just recently saw on social media when Elon Musk introduced his humanoids, and I was watching all of them walk around, and I'm watching this, and then it made me think of other movies that had this reminder. End of Days was another one. Is that the one with Will Smith? Was that the name of it? I can't recall it. It was so long ago.
No, End of Days was with Schwarzenegger.
No, that was Schwarzenegger. What was the one with Will Smith? Legend. Thank you, Gene. Legend. And then there's Megan. And it's so interesting because some of my students are here today. A couple of you are here. Megan resonates with the Generation Z in such a unique way. and even from the TikTok features that are being revealed. But the fact that this is a humanoid that really can do things here, it definitely brings our science and horror into another level. Now, who we didn't mention, we left purposely out a few others. Leprechaun, Jaws, for instance.
Beetlejuice. Beetlejuice is getting that
Beetlejuice, the
status. Yep.
thing, the thing, which is
Cujo.
Cujo. Oh my God,
Yes,
Christine.
Cujo.
Christine. Look at these others. Drop them in the chat.
Black
Zombie,
Lagoon. Yep.
the undead, creature from the Black Lagoon. All these, the mummy. Look at all these fascinating stories and icons that we've left out. Turkey from Thanksgiving. The Conjuring, the Blob. Invasion of the Body Snatchers. The Last of Us, Chupacabra. Now we're going now. I see where you're going, Dr. Vasquez.
Going to Crypt.
My sister, Professor Thomas. But folks, regardless of your icon, because there's so many, there's just too many to choose. This fun doesn't just have to end here. You have another day of celebrating this stuff. And we couldn't have had this fun conversation, though brief, though few, but significant. We really do appreciate all of you being here tonight, spending some time out of your busy evening and midweek to just share a little fun and fear with us. And thank you so much for all that you've done for us, Anthony. A special thanks to our friends at the Alumni and Friends BC Foundation, or Broward College Foundation, who makes all of these great events possible. As I shared at the beginning, this is our fifth, if not fourth, if not fifth. I've lost count. I got to go to get the count right. But we've done at least 4 of these for sure for today. This kind and type of collaboration, our annual tradition. It's so much fun. And every summer, good sir, I send you an email about May or June. I'm like, hey, let's put it on the calendar. Here's our date. And then we go about our lives. And here we are revving up for the final hour that has now ended. I now turn it over to you, Anthony, if you have any final words you'd like to share.
Well, that was fun. And look, we could go on for another couple of hours here. How often do 32 people get together to talk about horror? Just excellent. I just want to bring to everyone's attention that we do have a few other events lined up. 2 in November. One, I am looking for some alumni or non-alumni mentors to join us for lunch on North Campus. We're going to help our students there start to build their professional networks. We believe strongly at Alumni and Friends that students should be building those networks now, not when they graduate. So I'd love for some of you to be a part of that. Then we have the Panku Volume 61 release party. So we have some Panku alumni coming. And if you don't know, Panku is one of the longest standing student-run art and literary magazines in this country. And it's always a celebration to see what our students have put together. And then in January, we have a 5K. So check out our events, and everyone is welcome to sign up. You'll receive an email from me tomorrow with a link to this video, so please share that with your friends. I'll link to it on social media. Let's tell everyone about all the great things that Dr. Jones, Nadine, and Broward College are producing. So thank you for being here tonight.
And our final thanks to you again, BC Foundation and our Alumni and Friends Network, for making this possible and all those amazing events. Don't forget, folks, to go and camp on and follow on social media, on LinkedIn. We have our options as well for not only, I'll go back for a second, our Alumni and Friends Network. Make sure you're scanned and bookmarked. Make sure you join and visit us at our website on screen. So that, and also you'll keep in touch with all the things that we're doing. There are other events going on throughout the year, not just this one. Do seek them out and participate. And lastly, if you want to stay in touch with us, there's our QR code as well. You're welcome to find us on all platforms, wherever podcasts can be found. Fright Talk exists. And with that, I want to say special thanks to you, Professor and Honorable Nadine Tapsch, and my brother from another mother, my horror brother. Thank you for making this possible and for being here as well. And to all of you, tomorrow there is an event happening at South Campus. Dr. Vasquez just dropped. There's a block party taking place from 12 to 3 p.m. at South Campus. Come on through. And whatever you decide to do to celebrate this season, whether it be to watch a movie or to read a story or just to go home and carve pumpkins with friends or just have a reason to go and eat some treats, some sweets. Have a happy and safe Halloween with yours. And until next time, take care.